Hello, and welcome to the latest Faithful America webinar called Unholy Connections, the link between white Christian nationalism and anti-Semitic Christian Zionism. My name is the Reverend Nathan Imsel, Rev Nathan, and I am the Executive Director of Faithful America, as well as an Episcopal priest. And in a few minutes, I'll be joined by Reverend Alicia and Jonathan, two wonderful experts from Christians for a Free Palestine. Now, before we get into the topic that we're really discussing today, Christian Zionism, with our friends Reverend Alicia and Jonathan, let's take just a minute to say, what is Faithful America? And why are we talking about Christian Zionism? Well, Faithful America is the largest online community of progressive grassroots Christians putting our faith into action for love, peace, and social justice, making big, powerful wins for moral policies and against the scourge and hijacking of our faith that is called white Christian nationalism. Now, white Christian nationalism is, of course, dominant in our politics right now, creating political violence, a threat to democracy, a threat to the church. But it is not the only political ideology that drives the religious right. Another such ideology is called Christian Zionism. And many of the same players, folks like Speaker Johnson, seem to hold both Christian nationalist views and Christian Zionist views. So what is Christian Zionism? And how is it connected to white Christian nationalism? I'll give a very brief overview right now just to sort of set the table, but that is mostly a topic that will be for our speakers today. Christian Zionism is an ideology, and in this case, a theology, related to the end times that basically says a strong state of Israel must exist in order for the second coming of Christ to happen, because at the apocalypse, Israel will be destroyed. And all non-Christians, all Jews, all Muslims, etc., will be killed in a terrible, terrible war. Now, this is an appalling view. It's a very bizarre, weird interpretation of Revelation that is not really grounded in Scripture at all. And yet it is the animating force among the religious right for support for Israel. Christian Zionism can look very pro-Israel, pro-Jewish, because it supports a state of Israel, and yet it is ultimately rooted in the hope of the death for the sake of the end times of all Jews and Muslims, making Christian Zionism an incredibly anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim point of view. Now, how is this point of view related to white Christian nationalism? Well, as other staff at Christians for a Free Palestine have told me, the diplomat and poet Aimé Césaire, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, once said that fascism is just imperialism turned inwards, turned domestic. So this view that Israel must be existing, but for our purposes, it's very similar to the Christo-fascism we see at home, where white Christian nationalism is a force for power, for dominating others the way Christian Zionism is seeking to dominate them abroad. So there's this same link between these views of domination, of oppression, of control, all for the sake of power for conservative Christians and those like them. So these ideologies become linked in a quest for power, allegedly rooted in a conservative approach to the Bible. Of course, I would say that's no approach to the Bible at all, and many conservatives would agree. But we see the same power players in Washington, D.C. and in the church holding both views, and they become deeply linked that way. And they are both views of false prophets, of wolves in sheep's clothing, looking like they're pro-Israel, looking like they're pro-Jesus, when in fact they are just seeking to dominate and control for their own sake. So what has Faithful America been doing against Christian Zionism? Well, we continue to support a ceasefire in Gaza, something we've done a number of times. We've brought your signatures to the White House. We will continue to do so. When we put together our annual list of Christian nationalist false prophets, Christian Zionist views are one of the criteria we consider for inclusion on that list. We're now moving into an education phase with this webinar, and we're absolutely proud to be supporting the Interfaith Action for Palestine coming up later this month from Christians for a Free Palestine and others. They'll tell you more about the forthcoming Interfaith Action on Palestine for Palestine, but it's a big event at the end of July pushing back against Christians United for Israel, which is actually the biggest Christian Zionist organization in the country. So I can't wait for you to hear more about that, and we're excited to be sponsoring that. Now, speaking of Christians for a Free Palestine, today's webinar You're going to hear from Reverend Alicia and Jonathan right about now on what Christian Zionism is. They'll talk a lot about that. They'll talk about how it's connected to white Christian nationalism. They'll talk about the upcoming interfaith action for Palestine and how you can get involved, especially if you're in the DC area, but no matter where you are from home digitally. Then we'll take your questions and we'll be done in under 90 minutes. So who is Christians for a Free Palestine? CFP is an ecumenical, grassroots, nonviolent, and volunteer-led movement dedicated to mobilizing Christians across the US to take action in solidarity with Palestinians. Collectively, members of the CFP coalition seek to end the genocide in Gaza and ensure a long-lasting, just, and sustainable peace for Palestinians and Israelis. Following the leadership of Palestinians, including Palestinian Christians, and working in solidarity with Muslims, Jewish groups, and other interfaith peace activists, CFP's role is to mobilize Christians to take action in solidarity with all those struggling for a free Palestine, to interrupt and challenge Christian Zionism, and to resist empire in all its forms. The group's values are people, public, prayer, power, peace, liberation, and they believe that we are all created in the image of God and every life is sacred. CFP upholds the dignity of all people and rejects and resists all manifestations, not just of antisemitism and Islamophobia, but also of racism, heterosexism, and xenophobia. I'm proud now to turn it over. I'm excited. I'm thrilled to turn it over now to Reverend Alicia and Jonathan and to learn along with the rest of you so much more about Christian Zionism and why it is such a dangerous threat that we must take on. And now a confession. We had a technical glitch. Unfortunately, the first 10 to 15 minutes or so of this webinar were not recorded. That meant my introduction was not recorded, and the very first 2 or 3 minutes of Jonathan's remarks were not recorded. I'm very sorry. So I've just been sitting here re-recording the introduction. I am going to flip back to the original video now where it starts. I'm very sorry that you were going to miss the first 2 or 3 minutes of Jonathan's remarks, but you will catch the main thrust of everything he said. What you're going to hear doesn't really build on those first 2 minutes. They were introductory. He talked a bit about being a Palestinian Christian. I'm very sorry you missed those 2 minutes. They were good, but I think you're still going to get 98% out of this webinar, what you would have gotten, and it's the important 98%. So thank you for tuning in, and without further ado, here's Jonathan and Reverend Alicia from Christians for a Free Palestine.
To Palestine. And this idea of removing Jews from Europe into Palestine is the foundation of Christian Zionism. They tied it to a dispensationalist theology, and I'm not a theologian, so I'm not going to get into it too much, except to say that any theology that believes that certain people are chosen and certain people are not by God, that our nationality is something God ordained and not human made, is a racist theology and needs to be rejected. But this theology that was born in Europe and actually predated Jewish political Zionism. The phrase "a land without a people for a people without a land," this racist phrase akin to manifest destiny, akin to terra nullius, that was used to wipe out indigenous populations throughout North America, Turtle Island. This phrase of "a land without a people for a people without a land" was actually first coined by European Christian Zionists trying to remove Jews from Europe and place them in Palestine, trying to play God in that way to cause the second coming, as Reverend Nathan already mentioned. And this ideology then gets exported to the US and becomes a key platform of the fundamentalist Christian movement, as those leaders found that the predictive quality of it, the idea that we could determine the end of the world and that we could tell the future, that the Bible is really just a future-telling device. You don't have to worry so much about, I don't know, Jesus' teachings on love and, in my opinion, nonviolence. No, You just use the Bible to tell the future and then act towards that future. So it becomes a main platform of the fundamentalist movement. And then particularly when Israel is founded in 1948, and especially when Israel occupies and violently takes over Jerusalem in 1967, you see a spike in this Christian Zionist ideology, and it becomes a major platform for the Christian right, Christian fundamentalists, and including many Christian nationalists. Basically, they're able to say, look, we were right. Our prediction was correct. There's now, in their words, like Jewish control over Jerusalem. This is what we predicted. We must also be right about interracial marriage being a sin, about gay people being evil, about the role of women in society. And they're able to use this supposed correct prediction to justify all of their other horrendous political claims and build power as a Christian nationalist movement. And so the ties go quite deep to the point where I would say that Christian Zionism is the foreign policy of Christian nationalism. You know, when Trump was elected, a lot of people started talking about Christian nationalism. There were a lot of books. They almost all focused on the domestic policies, what Christian nationalists were wanting to do at home. Very few looked at what Christian nationalists wanted to do abroad. But Christian Zionism is really central to that idea, because most evangelical Christians, right-wing fundamentalist Christians, if you talk to them about Israel, they'll probably come to two related conclusions. One is that Israel as a nation is particularly chosen by God to bring about the end time. And the second is that Muslims are the enemies of Israel and therefore the enemies of God. Because you know this, Christian nationalists always have to have an enemy. And so the broader anti-Arab and anti-Muslim sentiment in the US, I think, is also deeply tied to Christian Zionism. So that's my very brief history of Christian Zionism. I will pass it over to Alicia to dive in a little more.
No, still on the wrong microphone.
Oh, sorry.
I heard you like a
Came
second.
in and out.
Apologies, everyone. This happens to all of us, everybody at some point, if not 20 points a day, if you're me. Hey.
I mean, can you hear me now?
All right.
Sweet. Y'all, technologies, and it fails us at times, but I'm so deeply grateful to Jonathan for giving that historical overview. And so I think the thing that it's important for me to highlight and to point to, that Christian Zionism is objectification, point blank period. It's about looking at a people for the aim to which you can use them. And not only is that deeply objectifying, it's also deeply violent. It's violent for the people who are being objectified. It is violent for those who are doing the objectifying, right? Because whenever you're engaged in that sort of dehumanizing, debasing type of activity, that violence also turns inward. It's also violent for the world. The position that the US and these Christian fundamentalist leaders have taken, Jonathan was very right to speak about how this influences our public policy. So when we look about militarism, when we look at war, at the ways in which we engage in war and who we are supporting in arming them, this is driven by this Christian Zionism. And I think it's also important to talk about the violence that people experience at home at these ideologies, because I know for me, growing up, I didn't hear about Zionism. Actually, that's a relatively new term to me that, I learned during my seminary years. But I was taught growing up in a Black Baptist tradition, and also in other places I've been as an ecumenical Christian, that there was this chosenness to Israel. But no one explained to me the histories. And so there may be some of you who are out here who have that experience. You've never heard the term, but you've heard about the chosenness. You've heard that there is a distinction of some people by God, which really counteracts this understanding that John 3:16 teaches us in God loving the entire world, right? Like, as a Christian, that's part of our buy-in, is that God loves us all, and that love is robust and full and just. And so what does it mean as Christians when we uphold and enact the belief that some of us are better than others? What happens when we lean into bigotry, bias, and xenophobia? Because it's not just the bias and bigotry, it's also like the othering of people and treating them some way out of that othering. And, I think this is a moment that presents a really unique opportunity in choosing who we will be, right? We don't have to follow the example of the Christians in the mid 20th century, who, out of their own sense of anti-Semitism, right? Let's call a thing, right? It's deeply anti-Semitic when you're like, how do we offload these people from our lands and put them somewhere else? It's an erasure of people from those places, from those histories, to not have to deal with them anymore. That's how you get the creation of what we now refer to, well, some people refer to as the state of Israel, right? Like, Israel comes into being because of people's anti-Semitism, which, again, violence, right? It's violence, violence, violence in so many ways. It's so compounded and robust, and really, I think it's the antithesis of the gospel, of this place where we find deep empathy and family and connectedness through Jesus. There's a leveling and a sense of equity that we can work towards, and understanding that we all have a place in the kingdom of God, where we're not ahead or behind one another, that there's parity in the kingdom. And when you look at Christian Zionism, you're looking at something that's deeply unequal in its both function and its ideology, because there's also a power differential at play. And what does it mean for Christians who have incredible religious power within the world, and especially within the US? What does it mean when we objectify people and basically say, hey, so we're setting you up, to take a fall so we can win ultimately? It's violent, it's wrong, it's unjust. And I'd say it's like in conflict with the gospel that so many of us hold true.
Got so many follow-ups, but before we dive into questions, can you tell us about, it's a slight shift from Christian Zionism, but can you please tell us about the upcoming Interfaith Action for Palestine, and which Faithful America is one of many proud supporters, multi-faith supporters. I'll just brag to everyone that this amazing action has as conveners so many great groups like Christians for a Ceasefire, Rabbis for a Ceasefire, Jewish Voices for Peace, Mennonite Action. But among all the different sponsors, you see Faithful America, certainly, but also our friends at Red Letter Christian. And I had the list in front of me and it's gone. But just the Christian groups among so many other faith groups, Catholic groups like Pax Christi and Marian Old Office for Global Concerns, individual parishes like All Souls Church Unitarian in DC, United Methodist for Kairos Response. It's just great to see the Christian witness among the multi-faith and interfaith witness against Christian Zionism. So can you tell us about this Interfaith Action for Palestine, July 28th to 30, and how people can get involved, whether or not they are in the DC area?
Absolutely. There are tons of ways to get involved. And right before I name those ways, I do want to very quickly address something that came up in our Q&A. Keep these questions coming, they're great. Is uncritical support for Israel functionally equivalent to Christian Zionism? It's a function of it, for sure. It's a type of it. And because you got to ask, like, what's the root? Why is this a thing, right? Like, why is there uncritical support? Why is there, you know, uncritical engagement around this? Why can't we question? Whenever you are in a place where you're not allowed to question, when you're not allowed to ask why, it's pointing to something there that we can do some investigative work behind. But to that end, you know, the Interfaith Action for Palestine, I think, is going to be a really good time. And it's a good time because we've decided, those of us who are conveners, to come together to speak against Christian Zionism. And it's not to say that there aren't other forms of Zionism that are out there, but one, Christian Zionists far outpace Zionists from other backgrounds. In fact, KFI, who is Christians United for Israel, it's a massive religious lobbying, insert other descriptive words body, but they have more members in KFI than there are Jews in the US, like in that singular organization. And so we're all coming together, you know, to do two things. One, to serve as a counter narrative, a living counter narrative to what's happening at the KFI annual conference. This is where our dates were chosen. I know some of you are asking, like, why couldn't they go when Netanyahu was here? It's like, because he's part of the problem, but there's more problems. So from July 28th through 30th, we will be convening in DC and online in order to counter that narrative that there's only one way to be faithful, and it's uncritical, unequivocal support for Israel. And we're saying that, you know, that is not true. And also we need to be calling for relief and release for our Palestinian siblings. And so we have incredible organizations who are Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, like the list continues to grow. We've come together to host this interfaith place where ritual and action have their space, and there's public rallies and demonstrations, but also place for like our rituals to live and to live alongside one another, right? Like, we're not going to like tuck the parts of who we are as distinctly religious groups away. We're bringing them to the fore, and definitely making space for just our shared but distinct faithfulness. And so, yeah, July 28th through 30th, that's going to be the case. And when I say online, there are going to be places where you can engage online, specifically around engaging in those public services and rallies, as well as doing some political education. Like, what does it mean for us to be educated together and to learn and to grow in our justice seeking, as well as our leaning into our faithfulness?
Thank you, Reverend Alicia. I want to share something about it's to you and everyone on the list about Pastor John Heggy, the head of KFI, and then turn that back to you as a question. So folks may remember, this is when Heggy came to my attention, and it really speaks to how far the country has moved, sadly, was in the 2008 presidential election. He endorsed John McCain, the Republican nominee at the time for president, as did a lot of religious right pastors, right? But Heggy's endorsement of McCain became particularly problematic because of accusations in the press and elsewhere that he was anti-Semitic because of Christian Zionism. And if I recall correctly, McCain repudiates that endorsement, and it's an albatross. It's a problem for McCain that he has Heggy's endorsement. Flash forward 16 years, and Heggy is very pro-Trump, and Trump couldn't, it's not a problem for Trump. It's a good thing for Trump. And so that just goes to show how much more toxic our politics and hateful our politics are becoming, but also how much more mainstream Christian Zionism, and as Jonathan said, it's foreign policy of Christian Zionism, how much Christian nationalism and Christian Zionism have become the mainstream, and why it's so important for voices like Christians for Free Palestine to be pushing back. The other thing about Heggy, many of you watching may know that Faithful America has been pushing back on Michael Flynn's Reawaken America tour for the last few years. Everywhere he takes this toxic blend of QAnon pastors and baptism and worship music and election denial, and now Pastors for Trump is part of that. When Reawaken America became really more infamous and well-known, including when we really took note here at Faithful America, was when Mike Flynn said, standing in a sanctuary at one of the tour stops, America is one nation under God. And if we're going to be one nation under God, we should be one religion under God. One nation needs one religion. And this got a lot of play in the press, and it was bad for Flynn. He got some pushback. But what got missed was where he said it, which was John Hagee's church, the head of KFI. John Hagee's mega church cornerstone in San Antonio. So he called for one religion, and thus the erasure of all the other religions, in a church known for it being the high church of Christian Zionism, and thus anti-Semitism. And even though John Hagee's son, who's now the pastor, they repudiated the remarks, the damage was done. But that really goes to show that link between Christian Zionism and Christian nationalism. When Mike Flynn is the one using the Christian Zionism base and infrastructure and churches to advance his Christian nationalism, bring them together even now. So I'm turning this back to you, I promise. Jonathan, Reverend Alicia, it's a question. I want to hear more. You talked a little bit about KFI and its size. Could you tell us more? And I know we've got some political nerds on the list watching today, more about the financial and political influence that Heggy and KFI and Christian Zionism have within Congress and DC, especially on Speaker Johnson, but also on some Democrats.
Yeah, so Christians United for Israel is the largest quote unquote pro-Israel organization in the country. And as we've said, being a right-wing organization, they also push for right-wing politics within Israel as well. So they're very supportive of settlement expansion, Israel actually expanding its settler colonial project further and further, to the point where, and they fund this quite regularly, to the point where John Heggy, the leader of Christians United for Israel, actually has a sports complex in an Israeli settlement named after him. And what's wild is it's actually really hard to trace the money from Christians United for Israel, because John Heggy, a few years back, there was a big expose about how rich he is and how corrupt he is. And so he was like, well, if KFI is a church and my TV station is a church and my church is a church, then we don't actually have to we don't have to disclose our finances to anyone, because churches get exempt from that. So using certain religious privileges, abusing them really, to avoid any form of accountability. And so it's actually really hard for us to tell, dollars and cents where the money's going, but we see the results, right? And we know that major players in Washington, D.C. come to the KFI conference. I disrupted the KFI conference a few years ago when then Vice President Mike Pence was a main speaker. House Speaker Johnson is going to be one of the, I believe is one of the speakers this year. They get kind of the top people from the Republican Party, but their influence clearly goes beyond that. I mean, one of the things that we're wanting to highlight is that what this current Democratic administration is doing is very much in line with what these hard right right-wingers are wanting to be done with regard to Israel and Palestine as well. And we've seen some of the caution that Democrats have for speaking out against the atrocities that Israel is committing is because they recognize that they have Christian Zionists in their constituency, who are very vocal, very loud. KFI has a big lobbying summit every year. This year it's July 28th through 30. So if you want to help disrupt that, come join the Interfaith Action for Palestine. And part of why we made that action interfaith, just to slide in another point here, is because KFI has a certain vision of what an interfaith relationship should be, right? They claim to be supporting of Jews by supporting the state of Israel, while actually they tend to maintain some of the or tend to promote some of the worst anti-Semitic tropes that there are. John Heggy has done this on multiple occasions. Reverend Nathan highlighted that he was so anti-Semitic that John McCain had to distance himself from John Heggy. But KFI wants to claim itself as having that vision for interfaith. And so we wanted to show what a true interfaith relationship could look like, one built upon solidarity, equality, and justice. And so that's one of the reasons why this challenging of Christians United for Israel is explicitly interfaith, and has a lot of leadership from non-Christian groups, while Christians also recognize we got a lot of work to do. This is also an internal conversation as well.
And one important feature of the KFI, the Christians United for Israel conference, is lobby day, right? So it's not just that we're talking about like money and energy being spent elsewhere. Like this is actually an organizing feature of their annual conference, is to have time on the Hill where they send their constituents. I mean, I guess they're calling it a church, so congregants, adherents, whatever, like they're sending them there in order to advocate for this parasitic relationship that they share with Jewish kindred. And it is parasitic because they're being used. And you know, we can talk, and we should be talking about how to have relationships like with our kindred who are a part of other traditions, but it needs to be one that is just and fair and caring and care-filled. And that is not what KFI, the Christians United for Israel, is doing. It's like, how do we use these people to get to our ends? And it's wrong.
I'm going to jump off that to circle back to another part of that question that Nathan asked. One of the big things that KFI is currently lobbying for is a redefinition of anti-Semitism that would put more focus on challenging the genocidal policies of the Israeli government, rather than any connection to actually Jewish people in the US. And I think this is very telling. So KFI is now trying to claim itself as fighting anti-Semitism, even though the leaders of KFI promote some of the worst anti-Semitic tropes. John Heggy has gone on record and continues to sell videos of sermons where he talks about Adolf, where he claims that God sent Hitler to get Jews back to Israel, that Hitler was actually sent by God. He talks about Rothschild bankers in Europe that rule the world. I mean, we're talking some of the most horrendous anti-Semitic tropes, and really dangerous ones. And polling has shown that Christian nationalists tend to be pro-Israel and tend to have some of the what was the poll? Sorry, I want to get the poll correct here. They tend to have some of the most mistrust of Jews in the US. So they're holding these anti-Semitic beliefs while being pro-Israel. And I think this is really important because for me as a Palestinian, it's been very clear to me that caring for Jews and supporting an oppressive state are disconnected. But that's a hard thing for a lot of people to get here. But when you bring Christian Zionists into the mix, because they are a huge part of the problem here, like you get to a better understanding of how that can be. That being pro-Israel does not make someone supportive of Jews.
And so some of you may be wondering, why it is that we're talking about Christian Zionism? It's because, as Jonathan said, as I've said, Christians is the problem here, right? Like with us having greater numbers of people who are in support of these toxic, dehumanizing, debasing policies that are being exported as a part of our foreign policy, but it's also the beliefs of the people. Like we had to do something. Like this is why Christians for a Free Palestine exist. There were, we were in our spaces and places, and we're like, you know what, we got to come together, right? Like there were really dope orgs and like efforts who were doing things, but like in terms of there being ecumenicism, in terms of there being accountability, like within the Christian tradition, like we're like, we can do that. And so like, you know, our leadership team, but also like the convening body, like the folks who've come together to form community, we're from all different walks of life. We hold different Christian beliefs, including folks who aren't Christian, but who are from Christian heritage. And it's a space where people can find one another at a time where so many of us have been asking, like, where are my people? Like, we're people who are in solidarity with Palestinians and Israelis alike. And I do say Israelis because when we talk about like resisting this anti-Semitism, when we talk about resisting Zionism, it is also an effort to be in solidarity with Israeli. And like part of solidarity requires having tough conversations about power. And so we talk about the establishment of the state of Israel and like in the way that settlers like play into that, right? Like, if I love you, we gonna have a conversation about the truth. We're gonna talk about how this is imperialist violence. We're gonna talk about what does it mean for you to just go and take land, like currently, right? We're not even just talking about like what's happened in the past, where you can just show up and take what doesn't belong to you and it like literally belongs to somebody else. We're gonna have those hard conversations because that's what care demands. And it is not anti-Semitic to ask questions. It is not anti-Semitic to question the way that power is functioning at this point in time. It is an act of deep care and of love and of really commitment to one another and like upholding our dignity and humanity to have these conversations about how we do or don't engage or enact in imperialist violence and settler colonialism and religious supremacy. And that's, you know, these questions we're turning inward. And by inward, I mean we're turning it on our tradition because we got to ask those things of ourselves, including too, even though they make me cringe, our siblings with KFI, they like, I'm not the type of person who believes that like they're not real Christians. It's like, but they are. They're following a Christian lineage. It ain't my lineage by any means, nor Jonathan's or anyone else on our leadership team. And I imagine it's not even yours, those of you who are tuning in. But it is absolutely an iteration of Christianity, and it must be reckoned with first with people within the tradition. It's our responsibility to call our siblings in. That's not the responsibility of people from other faith traditions, unless they so choose, because we're the ones who have the power by nature of, you know, Christian nationalism, Christian Zionism, as well as Christian supremacy in the way that it functions in our world.
I've mostly been off camera when I'm not actually asking the questions. And I think that's a good thing because right now, as Reverend Alicia was saying all that, like, come on, yes, 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 would have been just too distracting visually. But like all of that, it sounds just like what we say at Faithful America about Christian nationalism. So that there's another link here, right? People say, why do you call it Christian nationalism when it's not Christian? And we always say Christian nationalism is not Christian, but Christian nationalists are. And we're not going to question anybody's faith. And it's precisely as their siblings in Christ that we can say, please, we're praying for you. Come home to faith, hope, and love. And this is not what Jesus wants. And if they were Christian, why would we quote Jesus? Why would we talk about Jesus? So absolutely. Thank you, Reverend Alicia. I also want to note that when we talk about, you know, Jonathan was talking about ways to support our Jewish siblings as well and stand against anti-Semitism. And this is a conversation. This is a family conversation right now. This is a Christian organization with a Christian organization. So I do want to remind folks that the interfaith action for Palestine does include support and convenings. The conveners include Rabbis for a Ceasefire, Jewish Voices for Peace, and among many of the other groups involved, there's New Synagogue Project, Synagogues Rising, Reform Jews for Justice, Tikkun Olam Habura. So this is definitely a multi-faith project that got plenty of Jewish communities saying we need multi-faith and Christian support against Christian Zionism. So that's why we're talking specifically about this one form of violence today, when yes, there are so many others. But if you talked about all forms of violence and oppression at the same time, all you would do is spend an hour giving a list and not actually diving into any of them. That's how broken our world is and how called we are to fill that brokenness with healing. Speaking of filling it with healing, Jonathan, Reverend Alicia, in addition to the interfaith action, I've got two more questions for you, and then we'll spend our last 15 minutes taking a few more questions from the Q&A box. In addition to the interfaith action for Palestine, what can Christians do in their own churches, communities, and lives against Christian Zionism?
I mean, first thing to say, like, find support. That's one of the reasons why Christians for a Free Palestine was started, was a lot of people were feeling alone in congregations that did not reflect what they saw as just. And so joining groups like Christians for a Free Palestine or other Christian groups that are in solidarity with Palestinians, and working for peace and justice for all. Alicia, I saw that you unmuted, so I'm going to pause to let you share more.
Yeah, like as you find your folks, also be willing to have conversations and be gracious, as well as I can't think of the word, but like don't be afraid to like to be a little bit confrontational, right? Like it's okay. And I'm saying this because I know that in like in different communities and family systems, it's that either you just like go for it and just say whatever, or like you abstain, right? Like there's like a little bit of a teeter-totter, a balance that you have to have, because people, one, again, I shared that there are communities where they don't know this terminology, even though functionally they live into it. And also remember, you are on a journey yourself. I know that that's been the case for me, and it's part of what's made having one-to-one conversations or conversations within community be more care and grace filled, because I wasn't always here. I come from a very conservative Christian background. Like I like to tell people, like one of my like kind of party stories is I knocked on doors for Bush the second time. Like it wasn't even time one, it was time two. Like that's what I did. I was deeply, deeply within conservatism, and specifically was a registered Republican. And I'm not any of those things now, like because my looking to follow Jesus means that I find myself on the side of the most marginalized, right? Like shout out to the Catholics, the preferential option for the poor. Like, you know, there are ways that I've found myself leaning in that direction more and more and more. And so being on the people's side, being in the place where power has been obstructed and blocked, means that I got to remember where I came from, where that sort of triumphalism that comes and the celebration of violence, that objectivity, all those things are things that were espoused, but like nobody ever used the term Christian Zionism. Nobody ever used that languaging. It's just like, well, this is what we got to do. This is what's right. Okay, let's talk about why you feel this way. So yeah, be willing to ask questions, be willing to like say the hard thing while also making room for people not having this knowing, and for there to be like areas of mistrust that you have to work through because of the type of mis and disinformation that people have received. One of the questions I think that popped up in the Q&A is about like people's orientation around the scriptures. I would argue there's a lot of functional illiteracy within scripture reading. And folks, even if they read the scriptures, they read it with such a slant, such a bias, where they use the scriptures to speak to where they are. They're not actually students of the text. And so as you work to be students, as you work to hold it more fully, be open to the fact and be careful of the fact that not everybody is there yet. And there still is some grace that you can exhibit, even as you say the hard things, even as you challenge.
Thank you both. And I'll say now, before my last question, is that Reverend Alicia, you have now twice gone to my first two questions from the Q&A box. We had some questions here about, oh, they use this scripture, they use that scripture, and we could talk about diving into the individuals, but then you just kind of individual verses, but then you just make somebody feel argued against and debated rather than and yelled at rather than listened to, which is the way to draw them in. So that overall scripture approach of scripture education, like you're talking about, is probably a lot better than verse by verse, which is I know what some folks have asked about. And earlier you answered is uncritical support for Israel, equivalent to Christian Zionism. So you're bringing in all these questions as you go, and that's just how on top of things Christians for a Free Palestine is. Here's my last question, then we do have time for a couple more from the Q&A, and this is for you, Reverend Alicia, but Jonathan, feel free to jump in. Because Reverend Alicia, in your opening remarks when you started, you said that Christian Zionism isn't just violent to the objectified, but also to those doing the objectifying, that our violence always turns inward. And I think that's really powerful because we want to avoid us versus them perspectives against folks who follow Pastor Heggy or against Pastor Heggy himself. We want to stay rooted in compassion and love not just being against something. So I was wondering if you could just say more about that, unpack a bit more about how Christian Zionism harms its adherents too.
Yeah, I mean, I think about like, and this is a little bit of a like a picture because my mind works in pictures, but like when people do violence, right? Like let's say like someone's like cutting away at someone or something, like you're gonna get bloody, right? Like in the same way that you bloody another person, like you're gonna end up with blood on you. You're gonna end up with like the blisters of the instrument of harm, and then the moral injury that goes alongside it, right? Like even if like it takes some time for you to do your own sense of reckoning with these things as you learn, as you grow, it's just like, dear God, like what was I engaged in? And like then we have to then push it shame and like all these other things. But like whenever you harm someone, whenever you like counter the image of godness present in others, you're chipping at a part of your own soul. You're chipping at a part of, you're chipping at one of God's beloved, a part of this image of God. And so, of course, you hurt yourself because if we're all connected, if we're all God's children, if we're all God's beloved, then I can't, I can't hurt a part of the body without the entire body feeling it. Like you're still connected. Um, and so yeah, like that injury is moral, it's psychological, it's definitely spiritual. um and sometimes before people could have like that inbreaking, like where they're able to reckon with things, there's degrees of callousness and coldness that they have that allows for some of these more egregious violences to be upheld. um and that too is like it's a result of the ways that they're harmfully engaging the world, because you should be able to feel and to think and to emote and to engage and to live this dynamic complex life, where you have interdependence with people that is, I keep going to just because that's really what it is. And when you don't, you hurt even if you don't know that you're hurt.
Thank you. I think that's really powerful because folks, the question that comes up the most in this chat box and in any webinar we do really is how do I talk to people who believe this stuff? And I think if we remember that they are in exactly the spot you were just talking about, it makes it easier to talk to them with compassion, which can make it actually easier to reach one another. Remember that all the hurt that's going on there. Um, Speaking of which, this brings me to, we've had some great questions over the last 50 minutes or so, but I want to ask the most recent one from Martin. So this is great. How does someone come to believe or espouse this end times nonsense? And Jonathan, you touched a little on this in the beginning. How does someone come to believe or espouse these end times beliefs? And do they truly believe it? Or is it just an excuse for hatred and discrimination? Or does it depend? Is it both depending?
Yeah, I think it depends a little bit, but I mean, I think people genuinely believe this, and it is very much like baked into a lot of US culture. I mean, I just think about the number of best-selling books and TV shows about the end times or about the rapture or Left Behind or The Leftovers, like all of these that deal with the underlying theology that Christian Zionism is based on. But also what I found, and I have spent a lot of time talking with Christian Zionists and convincing some of them, that because it's not like explicitly taught, but more implicitly taught, because it's like just in the water, people don't hold it very tightly compared to some other like core Christian nationalist beliefs. So I've actually found that Christian Zionism really relies on people being quite ignorant on what's actually happening in Palestine. When people actually hear the kind of devastation that Palestinians are living under, especially now, like that there are 1 million children starving because of the choices of a specific government to intentionally starve them, that entire neighborhoods have been completely destroyed, that people have lost their homes, the number of men, women, and children who have been killed, it's hard to justify. Christian Zionism relies on ignorance so that they can shape the narrative to fit that biblical idea that they had. I mean, the number of times that Christian Zionists asked me if I rode a camel when they heard I was Palestinian. And they have the same idea of Jews, that they're stuck in the first century often. And because the fact is, most Christian Zionists have never met a Jewish person, have never met a Palestinian, and have never been confronted with the realities. Like any extremist ideology, Christian Zionism is based on ignorance. And that can very quickly be shattered. And there's actually a group, Christ at the Checkpoint, a group of Palestinian Christians who said, we will allow Christian Zionists to come here and speak at our conference, but you also have to listen to us. And that conference is going to be in the shadow of an Israeli checkpoint and of the Israeli apartheid wall that is splitting Palestinian communities in half. And make that theology make sense here. So yes, I think that people actually do believe it. I think they come to believe it because it's just become a part. So we talked about how fundamentals have it, but Christian Zionism has permeated basically every Christian denomination.
Mm-hmm.
But it's widely held and not deeply held.
And I really do want to like underscore that point of it being a part of our pop culture, right? Like it's not just American culture. It's like it is literally, it's pop culture. Left Behind has done so much damage on levels. Like I had to tell a relative recently that they were conflating things in the Book of Revelation with Left Behind. I was like, these aren't the same. But the thing is, unfortunately, there are churches who like interweave literal fiction with a very poor understanding of this biblical text that has like really rich dynamic imagery, but that's Jewish. Like, and we've taken and extracted and put our context onto scripture instead of asking and looking at what the context in which something was said, and then working to understand like if this has application today. It's like the inverses happen there. But like, yeah, we gotta talk about these pop culture things that like have shaped literal foreign policy, literal religious engagement, because that's very, very much the case. And it's hard because certain forms of fundamentalisms require a lack of questioning. It's very difficult to push at this sometimes, because to question some of these things is actually to sin, and people are so concerned with piety and with what they feel is honoring God, that when you start asking questions, it takes them to a scary place where they're afraid to let things go. This is like where I'm again encouraging where the grace comes in, because you got to keep that at the back of your mind. It's not that people are fighting you per se, but it's fighting this notion that they would fall out of favor with who they believe to be a vengeful God. That's not the way that I hold God anymore. Like I've released that, but there are a lot of people who still hold true to like God being very vengeful and like really petty. Like I've had to ask people, like, do you really believe in this petty God? Like, is that the best that the divine has for you? Okay. But it's a journey. And to Jonathan's point, like, you know, the not knowing people, I know that for me on my journey, again, I already told y'all, I used to be a Republican. Part of what started chipping away at the Zionism that I was encouraged to hold was actually talking to a Palestinian classmate when I was in university. And I had said like something that was probably like a KFI talking point, because I used to listen to John Heggy back in those days. I've had quite the journey. But I remember her asking me, it's like, well, what would you do if your people were subjected to these conditions? And she started speaking about the checkpoints. I started speaking about the controlled, you know, to electricity, about medical supplies and food being withheld, and what that does to people. And it put me into a position where for the first time in my life, I was probably about 20 or 21 when we first had this conversation, where things that were invisibilized were made visible to me. And so the truth that the truth actually did start setting me free and helping me to release Christian Zionism. And I think that as more people are confronted with the truth, that they'll find freedom and also advocate for freedom of our Palestinian kindred.
Thank you both. Yeah, I admit, in my younger days, I devoured the Left Behind books as they came out. I was never Republican, but my mom did call me my little fundamentalist once upon a time. The
Did you read the children's books too? Because they
no,
had a children's
not
series.
quite. I saw they were coming out, and I was like, "Oh, why am I just too old for those? That's terrible. I want those." No, But that's a great point. I mean, the education, like the children's books, the way this bleeds into the Sunday schools and I assume the Odyssey TV shows and that whole subculture, and you're just raised in it and baked in it, and don't know that there's anything else. But I
Well,
go ahead.
sorry, just one more thing, like the story that is told about Israel in the US very much connects to the story that Americans like to tell about the US as well, right? That, they came to this land, like foreigners came to this land, they made the desert bloom. Like it's a very like romantic colonial idea. And colonialism has been so romanticized in the US because America is a colonial project as well. So there's a deep tie there also. So.
Yeah, it's the reliance of mythologies, right? Because these are fake as fake can be, right? Like, but it relies on the same, you're right, Jonathan, the same mythology that like undergirds American understandings of itself are also like kind of transposed like onto the region. And we're not having conversations about history. I'm wondering how many people on this call or who are watching it later, how many of you all knew about the deep anti-Semitism in Europe that like caused Jewish expulsion in the first place? Like, yes, there was absolutely some guilt after World War II, but the guilt wasn't that deep. It was them wanting to get rid of the Jews who they've been trying to get rid of and or had been attacking for literal centuries. So yeah, there's definitely mythology that's working against the historicity of what actually went down.
And I just got to jump off of that point. I remember speaking with Mitri Rahab, a Palestinian Christian pastor, and he said, would the Europeans and Americans stop making us pay for your anti-Semitism?
Ugh.
Right? That like
Yeah.
European and American anti-Semitism over centuries led to Jews feeling unsafe in Europe. Whereas there's been a Jewish population in Palestine that entire time without nearly the level of discrimination and hatred against them.
Yeah.
And this is where like following the lead of Palestinian Christians, I think is really important as speaking as Christians, right? So there's a question of how do we feel about Palestinian violence? Based on international law, there are certain forms of violent resistance that are legal and certain forms that are illegal. But speaking as a Christian, as a Palestinian Christian specifically, I find no justification for violence of any kind. And what's amazing is Palestinian Christians came together from every different denomination and actually agreed that there is no justification for violence and that we must resist the violence that Israel is doing to Palestinians, and we must resist it nonviolently. And they said, we need Christians from all over the world to participate in this because we will not be successful if we're left on our own, while every other Christian is promoting the violence of Israel for us to be successful in our nonviolence. So the Kairos Palestine document asked Christians around the world to participate in boycotts, in divestments, and in sanctions of the state of Israel, 3 tried and true nonviolent direct action tactics. This is part of why we are using nonviolent direct action in response to that Kairos call. And what is so heartening to me is that, as far as I know, there is no other time in Christian history where all of the Christians of one land came together and renounced violence, except for Palestine in the first century. The way that Palestinians have, the through line for Christianity is that in Palestine in the first century, Christianity was nonviolent. In Palestine in the 21st century, Christianity is still nonviolent. So I want to invite everyone to respond to that Kairos call, to participate in nonviolent direct action in support of Palestinian rights. I would love for you to do it through Christians for a Free Palestine or through whatever means you have.
And like understand that connecting with us as well as with one another is also connected to lineage. Jonathan, I'm so grateful that you called those Palestinian ancestors from the first century into the being. Like we're not starting anew. We're not coming up with ideas for how to respond and react like willy-nilly. There are examples that people have set throughout the course of time, including that early Palestinian church, who the current Palestinian church is modeled after. Like so I'm charismatic, y'all. And so I'm like, ooh, yes. But like, I mean, I so feel that. Like there's something beautiful in this moment about us connecting to ancient wisdom, ancient knowledge, and ancient moves of God. Like there are ways that even in modernity, even in contemporary times, that we can connect with these principles that have allowed for the sustainability and flourishing of people, and to resist violence, to resist the violence of empire and its collusion with religiosities. We can do it. We should be doing it, period.
Thank you so much, both of you. We'll go maybe 5 minutes more, if that. So we're about to wrap up for folks who need to go somewhere, but we're desperate to keep hearing this wonderful content from you both. Jonathan said a few things, and I mean, you both so much here. You know, Jonathan, well, one thing I will say to this point about nonviolent direct action, and for Christians, we must always be nonviolent. As you can imagine, we've had a few questions in the Q&A, and we'll just touch on them very briefly here to say that, you know, asking, as always comes up in these conversations, what about the hostages? And of course, we condemn what happened. Certainly speaking for Faithful America, we condemn that violence of October 7th. And also the fact that we cannot condemn American support for the death of 15,000 people, over half of whom are children, and that we cannot condemn the starvation of 1 million children without talking about 200 hostages every single time is a false equivalence that makes it really hard to talk about anti-Semitism. And in some ways that starts to become a little bit anti-Semitic itself by not letting us talk about anti-Semitism. To kill 15,000 people, including the majority of children, to starve 1 million more children, is disproportionate to hundreds of hostages being taken, which is a horrible, immoral evil in itself. And these are both separate, and you can believe these separately without having to talk about them both constantly all the time, months on. Let's talk about what's happening on July 22nd, and July 21st, and July 20th, and July 19th, without going October 7th, October 7th, October 7th, every single time. All violence is wrong. Jonathan, I see you coming off mute there.
Yeah, just to give updated numbers, it's nearly 40,000 Palestinians have been reported killed, and unofficial estimates estimate around 180,000 have likely died due to the bombings and starvation and people who haven't been found. It is truly devastating. And I believe that the best thing that we can do for everyone, including the hostages, is to demand a ceasefire. All of this death and destruction that the Israeli military has caused has freed less than 10 hostages. The temporary pause alone freed over 100. And it's been very clear that if there is a ceasefire, all of the hostages will be released. So we continue to demand a ceasefire. Our top line demand is a ceasefire, and then also that the U.S. stop funding this genocide. And I don't use that word lightly, right? Like, this is after the ICJ has said that though they aren't going to give a full verdict on a crime that's still occurring, that their preliminary finding is that Israel is likely committing a genocide. And for Palestinians on the ground, we know it, we feel it. I was just spending time with a Palestinian poet who had to who fled Gaza literally weeks ago, last night, and his 3 incredible children. You know, just because I know it can get lost with all of these numbers. Like, these are human beings. You know, we were talking about his family back in Gaza and how they have to flee back and forth from different quote unquote safe zones that aren't actually safe. and how clean water is impossible to find, and how children aren't eating sand and eating things that aren't edible. And so, yeah, like we hold all the lives sacred, and 99% of the lives taken have been Palestinian. You know, and we live in a society where Palestinian violence is always decried. It's always condemned. If a Palestinian takes a life, they are a terrorist immediately. And we live in a society that is currently actively supporting the Israeli genocide. And that's why we speak so loudly about that.
And as you know, Americans, I think that we'd be doing this disservice if we didn't speak about the racialization like present in this moment. What does it mean when Indigenous brown people are seen as necessary collateral, as fodder? That's definitely a part of what's happening. Race is a central organizing a central organizing point, like here in the US, and that it goes also with how we engage with the rest of the world. And so, you know, I wanted to just sort of, just put that little note there. Like, we also need to talk about how, like, this country still has to reckon with white supremacy, and, that nationalism, like, has, like, all the stuff, it's, like, all braided together, right? Into, like, a funky braid, like, it's gross. Oh, Jonathan, like, you had just shared something, and I wanted to make sure to make note of this. Oh, okay, it was about the genocide. And without going too deep into the weeds, I do think that it's important to note that genocide is just not killing people. Killing people is horrific and it is wrong. But when you engage in a dynamic campaign in which you destroy bodies, cultural centers, hospitals, homes, roads, infrastructures, when like you are engaged in such robust violence where you're trying to stamp out hope or future targeting children, these are all elements of genocide. Like, you can go look it up, like the UN has a definition for genocide that I've worked with for years. This fits the markers. This is why IJC is a part of the conversation. This is why, like, the world and people are taken to streets and in the millions, because we know, we've seen this before. We've seen it in history books, but we've seen this before. And we're not trying to see this happen like in our time, and people are doing what they can. And that's part of what Christians for a Free Palestine is doing, as well as I'm sure many of you who are watching it on the call. And like Jonathan shared, we love for you to be in community with us, but if we're not your people, we encourage you to go find folks who you can share affinity with as you continue to fight for justice, to fight for freedom, to fight for liberation.
Thank you both. I want to draw a last connection between Christian Zionism and Christian nationalism here, because I'm hearing you say some things that are getting my gears turning. I know they're getting the gears turning of everyone watching. And then we got two quick questions and we'll be done. One question from me that I end every webinar with, but we'll pull one last one from our members too. Reverend Alicia, you're so right. What Christian Zionism does to indigenous brown folks, indigenous people of color, yes, in Palestine, but beyond, it's got me thinking of how white Christian nationalism is drawing on very specific, mostly white Christian theologies, completely erasing US Black church traditions while claiming to, as our friend Jamar Tisby would remind us, while still claiming to be Christianity, end of story. Like, there's only one story. And that word indigenous, well, when Jonathan was talking several minutes ago, Jonathan, you made the point that people learn you're Palestinian and they ask you ride a camel, and they trap you in the first century. And that reminded me that when I was an undergrad, my major was Native American Studies, and there are literal laws in Canada from the Canadian Supreme Court that do trap First Nations off-reservation rights into the 1870s and 80s. I think Delgamuck was the name of the Supreme Court case, and they basically say you can only do things in terms of your Indigenous and Native rights that other Canadians can't do if you did it in 1870, which means you can hunt on certain lands, but it's got to be with the bow and arrow. You cannot use other hunting weapons. You cannot ride a Jeep when you go hunting off reservation because you didn't do it in 1870. It's trapping people in the past here at home, trapping indigenous brown folks in the past at home, the same way it does abroad. Why? Well, you make this point that it's all about false myths. It's a story. It's a story they tell themselves. You know, one of your colleagues at Christians for a Free Palestine shared this quote with me. I believe it's from Ame Caesar. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, the Martinique poet and politician, that fascism is colonialism turned inward. So we're seeing the same theology. That's why Christian Zionism is, as you say, Jonathan, the foreign policy of Christian nationalism. It's a story of oppression, of dominion, of control, of those domination, control of those different than ourselves. And we need to replace that with a story in Palestine, in Washington, here at home. Replace the story of dominionism with a story of liberation and love and life. So my last two questions. Pulling from the Q&A, pulling several questions together. How do you tell that story politically? Are there any specific policy solutions other than a ceasefire, which always, every call for a ceasefire includes calls for the hostages to be released, as you point out? Do you support, people are asking in the chat, a two-state solution? What do you say to the current president and to the next president when when whoever they are take office, about funding for Israel and the weapons? What does the CFP advocate any specific policy solutions other than, in addition to a ceasefire?
That's a hard question, and I think it's one that's definitely evolving because we're an ecumenical organization with folks who came together at the onset of this year. There are ways that for policies we do need to flesh things out, but one thing I can tell you is going to be consistent is that we are calling for an ends of arming, right? Like that armament gotta go. Like the militarism has to go. And not just like the military, the commitments of both finances and weapons. One of the things that happened sort of quietly that not a lot of people knew about is that there's been an extension of presidential powers to actually commit military forces should that be called upon to any struggle without bypassing Congress. So Congress no longer needs an act of war to send the US military somewhere. That's at the pleasure of the president. And so these are the things that as a Christians for a Free Palestine, we can absolutely vehemently, from a policy point, oppose. And then there are other things where we just need to be in conversation. The question about like a two-state solution, I think that's a thing that we need to continue to talk about, not only at Christians for Free Palestine, but people broadly. I think what is not what needs to be, personally, and what is to come is something that we haven't dreamed of yet. And I think there's going to take a lot of courageous dreaming and planning, and also, again, confrontation and really hard conversations in order for us to get to where we need to be. So on the state solution side, we don't have a definitive thing that we've named yet. We're still like going to wrestle through that as an organizing body, but like definitely the militarism, deuces on the missiles, like let's cut them off. Absolutely not. Yeah. Jonathan, feel free to chip in.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say, I've gotten to the point where I get frustrated with the question about one state or two state solutions because, I mean, for one thing, for me as a Mennonite, states were never a solution. We're an anti-statist Christian sect. But also, like, it turns what's happening in Palestine into a like mental exercise, right? Of can you figure out a political way? None of us are going to be at the table to decide what the future political arrangement of Palestine looks like. I remember Israeli journalist Amir Haas saying, "I don't come with solutions, I come with criteria." And the criteria Palestinians have made clear. We want freedom, we want justice, and we want equality. Let me just say, an oppressed people calling for equality is quite a beautiful thing, because equality cannot mean vengeance, right? If we want to be treated like the other, it means that we're not going to destroy the other. It means that we are not going to have power over the other. We want to be treated equally. And that's why, like, the boycott, divestment, sanction movements, three calls of freedom, justice, and equality have always resonated quite deeply with me.
Thank you both. Beat swords into plowshares, study war no more. Blessed are the peacemakers, those who live by the sword, die by the sword. Deuces on the missiles. I love it. Interfaith for Palestine.com. Christians for freepalestine.com. Is that Christians for Free Palestine or for a, let's get the, yeah, it's Christians for a freepalestine.com. But again, interfaith for Palestine.com for the action July 28th to 30th. Please check it out. Here's my very last question. This used to come from our members, but I love it so much. We're just going to end every webinar with it. Both of you, Reverend Alicia, Jonathan, what gives you hope?
That's a tough question these days for me. I'll be honest. And I'm not sure I want to leave this crowd on a hopeful note, actually. Because it almost cheapens how dire the situation is. You know, as a Christian, I always have, you know, a certain level, base level of hope, but I think it's important not to skip past the grief and not to skip past the despair at moments where it arises. And, you know, with so many dead and with the government that I pay taxes to perpetuating the ongoing violence, I'll take the glimmers of hope in the organizing that's happening, but that's on the good days. A lot of days that despair is quite deep.
I think naming the glimmers is what makes sense, because wholesale hope, I think you're right, Jonathan. It's cheap and it's easy, and it's also oftentimes said from a position of distance, where folks aren't in affinity, deep solidarity, fellowship, or being. Like you can skip and sing happy, happy, joy, joy when this isn't your people, and when it's not people who you've come to call your people because they belong to you. But I think if I'm gonna point to a glimmer, it's the organizing, and it's those who I'm finding community with, that I can hold grief with, who I can wail and hold them as they wail, as we see the very methodical, intentional genocide of a people. That gives me a buoy to hold onto in the midst of a very rough seas.
Thank you both. Hope is the fuel that keeps us going, but it doesn't erase grief at all. Jonathan, thank you for that reminder. Thank you both that lament is such a powerful Christian concept too. And we hold to keep going, we hold our hope, but we always have to hold it with that grief, and that our own and that of others. That's really important. Glimmer was a better word. And that's where I get my glimmers too, is you, the work that is done at Christians for Free Palestine, for the 270 or so folks who tuned in today, and most of whom are still with us here at the end of our time together. Keep going, because that's where change comes from. Everyone watching, from you. You know, I know that we can't see our hundreds in the audience, but will everyone give at home a silent hand for Reverend Alicia and Jonathan? Really appreciate this time. Again, learn more about this important work and get involved at Christians for a Free Palestine.com and interfaithforpalestine.com. Love your neighbor, no exceptions, and that means everyone. So thank you both again, and we'll see you out there.